Welcome back. This is our ninth show in a series of shows entitled Rehabilitation Coming Soon, where we have been discussing the mass incarceration practices of the United States and the effect of those practices on the state of Hawaii. I am Aaron Wills, a William S. Richardson Law School graduate and a consultant for retired Judge Mike Towns' private mediation practice. Over the past 8 weeks, we have heard from people in the community who see the problem of mass incarceration from different perspectives throughout the legal community. Today, we'd like to hear the perspective of retired Judge Michael Broderick, who is currently the CEO of YMCA Honolulu. Judge Broderick, as CEO of the YMCA of Honolulu, has 9 branches, has 1,200 employees, and a $27 million budget. Previously, he was a family court judge where he presided over more than 10,000 cases involving families and children. Mike also was the director of the Hawaii State Judiciary, responsible for the day-to-day operations of the court system, as well as the director of the Judiciary's Center for Alternative Dispute Resolution. Mike has mediated or facilitated many complex public policy cases in Hawaii. Mike serves in leadership roles on a number of boards, councils, and commissions. He has received numerous awards, all related to strengthening the foundation of Hawaii's community. Mike received his undergraduate degree from Stanford University and his law degree from UCLA. He has been married to Miley Meyer for 34 years, and they have 3 children, Drew, Emma, and Hannah. Welcome, Judge Broderick.
Thanks, Aaron. Good to be here.
Well, Judge, the title of our show today is Native Hawaiian Justice Task Force, and I know that you were elected to be on this commission, and so I just would like you to kind of explain to us a little bit about what this task force is and why you agreed to serve on it.
Sure. You know, I agreed for professional reasons and for personal reasons. Professionally, as you mentioned, I was a family court judge, and I had so many Native Hawaiians appear before me in court, either on the domestic violence calendar or the Child and Protective Services calendar or on the juvenile calendar. And it just broke my heart to see a disproportionate number of Native Hawaiians appearing in family court. It's also personal because my wife is part Hawaiian and our 3 children are part Hawaiian. Right. So I was interested in serving on this task force for professional reasons and for personal reasons.
Okay, and you know, just kind of take a step back. I know that you mentioned you were as a judge before, and now you're the CEO of YMCA. Right. So I just wanted to ask you why you stepped down from the bench and you moved on to be the CEO of YMCA.
You know, you're not the first person that's asked me that. And the reason is this. First of all, let me say that it was a privilege to be a family court judge. It was an honor that I will always feel that I had a tremendous opportunity as a family court judge. That never changed. But over time, I came to feel that I couldn't help a lot of the people that appeared before me. On my juvenile criminal calendar, most of those kids had been sexually abused or physically abused or neglected. On my domestic violence calendar, it wasn't unusual for the person appearing before me to have 25, 30 criminal convictions, to have been an ICE addict for many years, to have been homeless. And I felt that as a judge, I could not help them the way I wanted to help them. In the meantime, I had been on the board of the YMCA of Honolulu for 8 years. Okay. And I saw all the programs they have for children, gang prevention programs, drug prevention programs, drug treatment programs, leadership programs. And I felt that maybe in the last twilight of my career, I could spend time on the front end preventing what I saw every day in a family court.
And I think it was an excellent choice because I grew up at the YMCA's.
Oh, great.
As a kid, I was at the Summer Fun Club, not here in Honolulu because I grew up in Nebraska, but on Maple Street YMCA. I remember clearly my mom and dad, you know, they worked full-time workers all the time, and so they needed someplace for the summer. So we grew up at the YMCA, and then coming out here, I was a member of the YMCA, and I also worked over there as a trainer. So I'm a big supporter of the YMCA, and it's a great job.
It's not unusual for people to tell me that in some way the YMCA impacted their life in a positive way. So I'm glad to hear that was the case with you too.
Yep, all we used to do back when I was a kid was play pickup basketball. And that's how you do it. You just pick up the ball and the gym's open, you go up there and play.
Great, great.
Well, I know you were the chair of this Native Hawaiian Task Force. How did the task force come about, and what organizations were represented as far as the task force mission is concerned?
So the task force was created by law.
Okay.
So it was different than something created by a resolution. So the task force had to meet. It was created by law, and I'm gonna see if I can remember this. There were 9 members of the task force, and let me see if I can remember it. If I can, I got my cheat sheet.
Okay,
here.
no problem.
So we had a representative from the prosecutor's office,
Okay.
from the public defender's office, from the attorney general's office, from the Department of Public Safety,
Okay.
from the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. We had 2 representatives from the judiciary, an administrator and a circuit court judge. We also had a criminologist and then someone representing the public, and that was me. I think that's 9.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the purpose of the task force was to develop recommendations to try to address the fact that we have a disproportionate number of Native Hawaiians at every stage of our criminal justice system.
And that is based on the OHA report that came out,
Right.
as far as the over-incarcerations of Native
Right,
Hawaiians.
and there are at least 2 other reports that came out as well. One, I believe, in the 90s and one in the early 2000s that all showed the same thing. So nobody can deny the fact that there's a disproportionate representation of Native Hawaiians in the criminal justice system. The more complex question, which we'll talk about in a little while, is why is that the case? But nobody can deny that, in fact, those are the numbers.
And just to be clear about the numbers, I believe the numbers are somewhere in the range of Native Hawaiians representing about 14% of the population here in Hawaii, but they represent about 43 to 44% of the jail population of the rate that they're actually incarcerated.
My understanding is it's somewhere between 35 and 45%.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, and what was the basis for the task force findings and recommendation? Did the task force solicit testimony about?
Yeah, so it was quite a task, actually. It was a lot of work. The task force met 13 times as a task force. 11 of those meetings averaged about 2 hours. The last 2 meetings totaled 14 hours. So together, we met about 35 hours.
Wow.
In addition, we went out to each of the islands, including Oahu. We went to Kona, we went to Hilo, we went to Maui, we went to Kauai. We did hearings in each of those islands, and we heard from approximately 150 people. And so that testimony helped inform our findings and our recommendations. In addition, members of the task force actually went to the men's prison on Oahu, the women's prison on Oahu, and we met with prisoners at TJ Mahoney's. So we actually talked to prisoners themselves to get their thoughts. So between the meetings of the task force, the public hearings of the task force, and prisoners themselves, we used all of that input to develop our findings and recommendations.
Now, I went to the first meeting of this. I was actually sitting in the front row, kind of taking notes of the meeting. A lot of that testimony was pretty contentious at times, and there were some pretty upset people. What was your opinion about the testimony?
You know, I would describe the testimony as emotional.
Yeah.
For a number of people, they had been in prison themselves, or their family had been in prison, and they were angry.
Yeah.
They were bitter. They were disappointed at with the system, and I think they were desperate for some change in the process. Those are kind of my recollections of the people that we spoke to.
Okay. Well, let's talk about what some of the practical recommendations of the task force were. I wonder.
There were over 50 findings.
Oh, wow.
And there were 38 recommendations.
Okay.
I'm not smart enough to remember them all, so I've written down 8 what I would call practical recommendations, and let me review those and then I'll elaborate on them. One was mandatory training regarding unconscious implicit bias. So there was a general feeling among the task force that although none of us want to be biased towards Native Hawaiians, that there's an inherent unconscious bias. So that was a finding, and one of the recommendations was that we have mandatory training for all of those folks who come in contact with Native Hawaiians throughout the criminal justice system. That was one. Another practical recommendation is that businesses that hire ex-offenders should be given a tax credit incentive. There was a general feeling among the task force, based on the feedback that we received, that employment, in particular long-term employment, was critical to ex-prisoners. So we were trying to provide some incentive for employers to hire ex-prisoners. As you can imagine, many employers are very reluctant to do that.
Absolutely.
So that was a practical recommendation.
Okay.
A third one was that the Hawaii Parolee Authority hearings should be conducted in person, not by video conferencing.
Oh, okay.
That gets to the issue of prisoners who are moved out of state.
Yeah.
When those prisoners have hearings before the paroling authority, they're by video conferencing.
Mm-hmm.
And what we learned was that that places them at a distinct disadvantage. So one of the recommendations was that all hearings before the paroling authority should be face-to-face. A fourth practical recommendation was mandatory educational programs for guardians of minors who have a parent in prison.
Wow,
So
okay.
what we found out was that if you're a minor and you have a parent in prison, there's a greater chance that you yourself will end up in prison.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So the thinking was that the guardians of those minors should know that and should be educated about ways to relate to their children to try to minimize the chances that they're going to end up in prison. A comparable program in family court is called Kids First.
Yes.
And in Kids First, parents who are going through divorce and children who are going through divorce go through a program, an educational program, to kind of help them deal with their emotions.
Yeah.
And this would be a similar idea.
I went through Kids First.
Okay,
the
so
Purple
you know,
House.
was it helpful?
You know, it's hard because you're there, you feel like you're there on
Yeah.
business, and you're there kind of like, oh, I want what I want, and she wants what she wants.
Right.
When you
Right.
saw what that did, it made me refocus on
Good.
what really matters.
Good.
Because what it made me focus on was, well, we're here for our son. We're not here for any
There you
personal
go.
thing that I want or any personal thing that you
Right.
want. We're here for him.
Right.
Once we turned that focus back in on why we're here in the
Right.
first place, it was easier to accept what we were going through. But the show in and of itself makes you feel a little uncomfortable when you're watching
I
it.
can understand that.
Yeah.
I can understand. Anyway, so we're hoping that by educating the parents of minors, we're going to have a better chance of reducing the kids ending up in prison. So a fifth practical recommendation is that prisoners who are housed on the mainland should be returned to Hawaii in time to complete pre-release transitional programs. What we found was that prisoners who were on the mainland were not released in time to complete those programs. So this is a very practical recommendation. A sixth recommendation was that prisoners who are housed on the mainland should be allowed to practice their cultural traditions in mainland prisons. We found that when they went from Hawaii to the mainland, they suddenly were no longer able to practice their religious convictions. And also, if they had religious statues, say, or things that were religious that the prison had safety concerns with, that didn't exist here, but when it went to the mainland, suddenly those safety concerns existed, and those items were taken from the prisoners.
You know, they're actually trying to, I know Saguaro right now is trying to do, where we house 1,500 prisoners, in this part of Saguaro, they have this place called the Faith Pod. And in the Faith Pod, they're actually trying to implement some of these things. I've seen prisoners actually doing hakas as a group.
I'm so glad to hear that,
yes.
because those are the very things
Yep.
that at one time were prohibited.
Yep. And so I know that they're trying to work that in, and a lot of the prisoners have been, saying that we need this, and it's part of us, and we need to be able to do it
Good.
on a regular basis.
So I've got two more practical
sure.
recommendations. And again, remember, I'm just pulling out some of the 38 recommendations. So a seventh is that prior to release, prisoners should get an official state identification and, if needed, a Social Security card. So what we found is that prisoners would be released from prison without any identification. Try to rent a house without identification.
Yep.
Try to get a job without identification. So this is a very, very practical recommendation that you would think wouldn't be needed, but in fact it is needed. And then the last one I wrote down here was that all correction officers should receive mandatory training regarding trauma-informed care. We'll talk a little bit later about trauma, but we found that the vast majority of the people who testified before us, and I'll talk later about those that I saw in family court, had been traumatized in some way. And so we wanted people at each stage of the criminal justice system to receive, each of those people that touch the different parts of the system, to receive training around trauma.
You know, and I think that's a great point to bring up. Two of our previous guests, Mark Patterson and Tony Bisson,
Yeah.
they both came on here and gave wonderful exposés of trauma-informed care. So if you guys, our audience is interested in learning a lot more technical details about trauma-informed care, please go back and look at our previous shows with Mark Patterson. And it just explains it, and with Tony Bisson, who's the executive director of the PUA Foundation.
I'm glad that they both have a lot of experience in that area. And again, later I'm going to speak a little bit about what I observed.
Sure, no problem. Okay, so we will be right back with retired Judge Mike Broderick. My name is Aaron Wills, and this is Rehabilitation Coming Soon.
You're watching ThinkTech Hawaii, meeting people we may not otherwise have met, helping us understand and appreciate the good things about Hawaii. Great content for Hawaii from ThinkTech.
Aloha, everybody. My name is Mark Shklov, and I am the host of a program called Law Across the Sea. And the goal of our program is to show people in Hawaii a little bit about international law and how it touches our shores, especially with guests who have gone beyond the reef and practiced or done international law in other countries and brought it back to Hawaii, and to show its significance to our people and our economy. So I hope you'll join me Mondays, 11 a.m., every other Monday, 11 a.m. on ThinkTech Hawaii. Thank you very much.
Welcome back. This is Rehabilitation Coming Soon, and we're sitting here with retired Judge Mike Broderick. Okay, Judge, well, you mentioned this before. You said one of the report findings was that implicit and unconscious bias and disparate treatment on the part of the workers at all stages of the criminal justice system may explain a portion of the disproportionate representation of Hawaiians in the criminal justice system.
Right.
So when you were a judge, did you witness this type of bias?
Yeah, first of all, let me, I think the preliminary question should be whether I exhibited bias as a judge.
Okay.
So let me speak to that.
Sure.
And sadly, I think the answer has to be yes, because it's implicit and it's unconscious. And what we found was that there were certain members of the task force who really struggled with this idea. They felt in the year 2013 or 2012, when the task force met, that no one has any unconscious implicit bias. And what I would argue is that's why it's called unconscious and implicit, because you're not aware of it. So even though I actually tried the hardest to be the fairest with Native Hawaiians, because of their history, because of what they've suffered, and because my family's Native Hawaiian, I'm convinced and will always be convinced that I myself showed implicit unconscious bias. In terms of, did I observe it in the Attorney General? Did I observe it in the prosecutors? Did I observe it in the public defenders? The answer is no. I didn't observe it, but I still believe it was there. But again, I think it was unintentional.
I'm not sure, maybe you could help me with the name here, but there was a professor in my law school, one of my favorite professors. Her name was Mari Matsuda.
I know the name.
But her husband gave a talk, and he's a professor as well, but his name is just dismissed in my head right now. So his basic talk was about implicit biasness. And when he gave this talk, he gave it up at the Access to Justice Conference in front of a room with a bunch of, attorneys. And attorneys of, from the beginning to the end of their career, everybody was kind of in the room. It was the most powerful speech I've ever heard, because it's exactly like you said. There's implicit biases that we're born with, that we don't even understand, that we unconsciously do every single day. And he kind of explained what some of these things were. And once you take a step back and realize you could be part of the problem,
Right.
It's easier to accept.
I'm curious, Aaron. Was the audience open to hearing him, or were they defensive?
Well, he started off by saying that this was the legal state of Hawaii.
Okay.
And so a lot of people get defensive immediately once you start off like that.
Right.
But as he went into his whole talk, and people started to loosen up and to this idea, like, maybe we are more of the problem than we think we
I'm
are.
so glad that they were open to that possibility.
Yeah, it was
Good.
great. He was a great lecturer. So as member of the chair of the task force, what did you learn about the good and the bad of sending our prisoners to mainland prisons?
Yeah, well, one of the things that surprised me is that there is any good at all. Because I think the general sense is that everything is bad.
Yeah.
That there are no advantages at all, and that's not true. Here's what we found out. We found out that, first of all, they are treated better by the correction officers, which is a sad commentary. Correction officers in Arizona treat our prisoners better than the correction officers in Hawaii. We continually heard that. I was very surprised to hear it, but it was something that came up time and time again. The other thing that came up often and was disappointing to me is that they have more programs and more effective programs on the mainland.
Okay.
There was a consensus around that. And then there was one more, and that's that the conditions are less crowded.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And again, that was a surprise for me. So those were some of the good things for a prisoner being in a prison on the mainland. The bad things, the first one is the most obvious one, which is they have no visits from their family.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're separated from their culture. And prisoner after ex-prisoner testified how difficult that was to be in a foreign culture and to not have the opportunity to see their family. So that was one of the disadvantages. Another was that the parole hearings are conducted remotely, so we've already talked about that, video conferencing as opposed to in person. And then the other one was inadequate transition plans regarding housing and employment. We've talked about that as well. So what we learned was that there are both advantages and disadvantages to being in a prison on the mainland when you're born and raised in Hawaii and you're native Hawaiian.
You know, I think one thing that you said is important to emphasize is the cutting off from the family. When I was doing my research and I was writing my paper for law school, you know, some of the stories are, in order for a family to go, there's a window of visitation at the prison in Saguaro. Right. And sometimes they'll have to buy their plane tickets, and you're talking maybe a low-income family that'll have to save up for a year or two just to get their plane tickets in place. They'll go over there, and something will happen in the yard where there'll be a lockdown, and that window that they have to see is all of a sudden canceled. The flights can't be changed. They have spent $2,000 to go over there and see them. And this has happened repeatedly, not just one or isolated incident.
We talked about trauma. That's traumatic.
Oh, it is.
That's traumatic for both the prisoner and for the prisoner's family.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why these type of prisoners that are moved, they need the incentive to want to rehabilitate, to get better.
Yeah.
And when you take their family away from them, that incentive to get better is not there.
Yeah. The other recommendation that I haven't talked about was that the task force recommended that prisoners, Native Hawaiian and non-Native Hawaiian prisoners from Hawaii who have been transported to the mainland be returned. There was a strong feeling among the task force, but safety had to be the first priority.
And as we know, as we talked over the last 9 weeks on this show, and also it's just the political momentum to get people to want to spend money on prisoners and space. We're out of space over here. We need to build new prisons. And
Governor Abercrombie, I think I'm remembering this right, I believe that Governor Abercrombie publicly stated that he wanted to return all mainland prisoners to Hawaii. I don't know where Governor Ige is on that, whether he's taken a position on that or not, I'm not sure.
Well, there's been a couple of articles written in the paper that the state is going to go ahead with their relationship with CCA and
I've read that as well.
So it's kind of an indicator, but. So I just wanted to ask, so based on your years on the bench and more than 10,000 cases you had as a family court judge, why do you think that Native Hawaiians are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system?
Yeah, so let me share with you my own personal view on this. First of all, I think trauma is a major reason. And when I think of trauma in the context of Native Hawaiians, I think of it in two contexts. One, intergenerational trauma. And what I mean by that is that the Hawaiians lost their land, they lost their language, and they lost their culture. That's trauma. The second type of trauma I think about, which is related to the first, is that many Native Hawaiians who appeared before me had been physically abused, had been sexually abused, or had been neglected. So I believe that both of those traumas lead to criminal conduct. A manifestation of that trauma is criminal conduct. And let me share this with you.
Sure.
I believe that this is the most significant finding of the task force, and I'll read it to you verbatim. Any effort to reduce the number of Native Hawaiians which come in contact with the criminal justice system must, and the word must was underlined in the report, must include a multi-pronged approach to addressing this trauma. For me, that's the most important finding and recommendation of the report. There are other reasons why I think Native Hawaiians are disproportionately represented. One is we don't have enough public defenders. So only 1 in 5 low-income people have access to the courts. Okay? 1 in 5. That's not good. Another reason is that existing programs are too few and often don't have a cultural dimension to them. And in a couple minutes, we're going to talk about the importance of culture. A fourth reason is that the prisoner, the ex-prisoner, often cannot get housing, and most significantly, cannot get employment after serving in prison. And listen to this quote from one testifier. It has been shown statistically that the biggest contributor to not offending is long-term employment. The biggest contributor to non-offending is long-term employment. So when we don't even provide an identification card for someone, it's very hard to be realistic about expecting them to have long-term employment. So that's another reason. And again, though, keep in mind that there were 38 recommendations. So I'm just sharing a few of those. But those are the ones for me that jump out. And again, I end up mostly around the issue of trauma. Now, I must tell you, there are many, many people in your audience who are saying right now, I strongly disagree with that guy Broderick. Okay? Because I've had many friends and family members tell me they strongly disagree with me. They think that there was no trauma, or that if there was trauma, it's completely unrelated to the criminal conduct. So I think there's a lot of educating that needs to be done around the issue of intergenerational trauma, but I believe in it strongly.
That's well said. Okay, well, I wanted to go back to something you said earlier.
Yeah.
So the task force spent a lot of time talking about the need and the value for culturally based programs.
Right.
Okay, so why, in your experience on the bench, do culturally based programs work?
Okay. First of all, I want to read a quote from someone who testified before us, and this was someone who had served significant amount of time in prison.
Okay.
And at the time, he had been released when he testified before us. Listen to this quote. You can't put me in a small office and do individual counseling because I feel smothered. I feel cluttered in a small little room. I had my individual counseling in the loy, pulling tarot with my counselor. I had my individual counseling bouncing in the water, in the ocean. They took me outside the building because universe, Hawaii, ha, language, oli, kahea, stories, legends, all those things. In a group setting, like I said, Ho'oponopono style, going out to paddle, taking the services outside while practicing my culture at the same time, end of quote. Now that is a tremendously powerful quote from someone who benefited from culturally based practices. In terms of my own experience as a family court judge, one of the saddest things for me was on my juvenile criminal calendar. I had about 1,800 cases on my juvenile criminal calendar. And let me tell you the way it would go. A 15-year-old boy would come in before me, a 16-year-old girl, a 17-year-old boy, and I would say to them, what is it that you care about? What do you have passion for? What do you get up in the morning for? And do you know the number one answer?
What?
Nothing. They would say, Judge, I had passion for nothing. That was very traumatic for me to hear. And that was by far the most common answer. Now, if I took that young man or young woman and I sent them to an immersion school, or I sent them to a charter school, and then they came back for their 6-month review, and I said to them, what is it that you have passion for? What is it you care about? I couldn't get them to stop talking. In that short period of time, they had become connected with their Hawaiian culture. They had become connected with the land. They had become connected with the language. They, for once in their life, felt good about themselves and good about their genealogy. So I saw firsthand how critical culturally based programs are to Native Hawaiians.
Oh yeah, and just to talk about the trauma, I mean, when a child has trauma the intergenerational trauma you're
Yeah.
talking about and the cultural trauma. What you're referring to as far as they don't have passion is they don't dream.
Right.
These kids don't dream big because
Right.
they're so traumatized from what they've been through. All they do is they hope on surviving.
Sure.
They just getting
Yeah.
through. And
That's
when I
right.
grew up, you know, my parents both worked, but because they worked, it allowed me to dream. I mean, I dreamed about things about being the best football player in all the world and all
And
that
you
kind of
were a
stuff.
great one.
Yeah, I actually did play, but you know, it's just having the ability to dream.
Right.
You know, and to think beyond just your situation.
Right.
And I think that's what a lot of the Hawaiian kids are stuck in these days. That they're just stuck in this situation of this high cost of living. Parents are grinding. You know, we're just trying to survive here, and they just don't have the ability to dream big.
I agree with that. The other thing that I found that a lot of the youth who appeared before me didn't have was trust.
Yeah.
So I would say, let's assume you were the young man. I'd say, Aaron, I care about you. I'm committed to trying to help you. Together, we're going to figure this out. Sometimes they might respond to that, but often I could tell that they were saying to themselves, yeah, right. Sure you are. Because every adult that they had encountered in their life up to that point had let them down,
Right.
had shown that they couldn't be trusted. So why should they trust this guy who's wearing a black robe and is seeing him for 15 minutes?
That's absolutely right. Or they would say, I care about you, and then act a completely different way 10 seconds later.
Right.
You know, and then so they have a distrust with those words that come out of your
Right.
mouth. Well, you don't really care. All right, so this is great. We'll be right back after these messages with retired Judge Mike Broderick. My name is Aaron Wills, and this is Rehabilitation Coming Soon.
You're watching Think Tech Hawaii, offering lifelong learning from passionate hosts and fascinating guests ready to explore and explain Hawaii's place in the 21st century. Great content for Hawaii from Think Tech.
Hi, I'm Kili'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute. I'd love you to join us every week, Mondays at 2 o'clock p.m. for E Hana Kako. Let's work together. We report every week on the good things going on in our state, as well as the better things that can go on in the future. We have guests covering everything from the economy, the government, and society. See you Mondays on E Hana Kako at 2 o'clock p.m. Until then, I'm Kili'i Akina. Aloha.
Aloha, I'm Kaui Lucas, host of Hawaii is My Mainland, here on Think Tech Hawaii every Friday at 3 p.m. We address issues of importance for those of us who live here on the most isolated landmass on the planet. Please come join me Fridays at 3 p.m. Mahalo.
Okay, welcome back. I'm Aaron Wills. This is Rehabilitation Coming Soon, and we are discussing the criminal justice system with retired Judge Michael Broderick. Okay, Judge, well, I just wanted to kind of switch the topic of conversation here to
Sure.
Children of incarcerated parents. There's a lot of, data out there that suggests, and you mentioned it before, that if one parent or both parents are incarcerated, the likelihood that that child will actually be also involved in the criminal justice system or incarcerated goes up almost like 70, 80%.
Right.
And so I wanted to, first of all, are the kids, as we just said, more likely to end up in prison? And did any of the task force recommendations address this issue?
Okay. So clearly the kids are more likely to end up in prison. All the empirical data shows that. And anecdotally, I can tell you that many, many, many of the youth who appeared before me on the criminal juvenile calendar had parents in prison. It was unbelievable, you know. And yes, as I mentioned, there was a recommendation that said that for the guardians of minor children who have a parent in prison, those guardians should have an educational program, basically putting them on notice of the empirical data, and then working with them on ways to ensure that their minor did not end up in prison. So that was an important recommendation. That was the only recommendation of the report, though, involving minors, because right around the time the task force was doing its work, there was another report that was issued, I can't recall the name, that focused exclusively on children and recommendations around children. So we tended to focus on adults with the exception of that recommendation.
Oh, and I know, there's lots of groups out there that really kind of focus in on just this issue, children of incarcerated parents. I know that Stephen Morris runs a company called Blueprint for Change.
Yeah, he testified before the task force.
Yep, and he's been on our show too, so
Okay.
he had a great. And then there's this other group that actually uses the YMCA called Camp Agape, where
Right.
they just work with children of incarcerated parents. And what they do at this camp is they actually just take kids who are referred through, like, actual prisoners, and these are kids of incarcerated parents, and they throw a camp for them.
Right.
And you know what's amazing? I've been to this camp. You've been there. I've seen you there, and it's amazing because when these kids first come, they're hard. They won't let people get close.
That trust issue.
The trust issue that we talked about, that's right. After about 3 or 4 days of this camp, these kids are just exploding with love. They've never seen so much love.
Right.
And the greatest part about it is that it's giving to them something that they need from their parents, but they don't get.
Right.
And so that's why
Right.
they're just so willing. And by the time that the camp's over, I can tell you that half of the kids are crying because they don't want to go back.
Yeah, I know, I was crying.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that makes that camp so special, and you referenced that it's held at Camp Urban, which,
Yeah.
by the way, makes me very proud that that's one of the camps that we host. But one of the things I think that makes the camp so successful is that those kids realize for the first time they're not alone.
Yeah,
That
that's
there are
right.
many other children who also have parents in prison. And I think there's something comforting about that.
That's right. And the one thing they do good with the camp is they give things away that these kids never could probably dream of
I didn't
having.
know that. That's great.
They
to
give
hear.
them surfboards. They buy gifts for them.
Yeah.
They have these contests, and they have games for them all week long. So
Yeah.
it's a great camp, and I really appreciate that. What will it take for the task force recommendations to get implemented?
Yeah, when I wrote, because I was the chair, I wrote a preface to the report, and I indicated that the task force was just the beginning, and I meant that. What we need is the collective will of the entire community, and specifically we need the legislature to pass certain bills. Certain of our recommendations require changing in bills. We need the governor to implement some of these through his various departments, including the Department of Public Safety. We need all of the not just the branches, but the entities within those branches, for example, to take that implicit unconscious bias. So it's going to take a lot of work by a lot of entities and a lot of individuals to move forward with this recommendation. And I'll read this. The very last recommendation of the task force addressed this issue. And the task force recommended that there be permanent funding and full-time staffing in the appropriate agency to oversee the implementation of the recommendations. We felt, and I feel even stronger now, that there needs to be one person who's devoted solely to moving forward with these recommendations. That requires funding, and it requires a staff person.
I was just wondering, we've been talking about implicit bias, because you were a judge before on the the family court. Do you know that do the judges take training on this?
Yes,
They do?
absolutely.
Okay.
One of the things that I was able to say to the task force, and I was able to say it with some pride, is that the judges have gone through mandatory implicit unconscious bias. So why shouldn't the prosecutors? Why
Right.
shouldn't the public defenders? Why shouldn't the correctional officers? Why shouldn't members of the paroling authority? If the judges are doing it, and they feel it's valuable, it should be valuable for others. The other thing, last thing I wanted to mention as we wrap up the show is that we didn't reach a consensus on all of our recommendations. We reached a consensus on a number of them, but there are also a number where we had to put it to a vote. And there were a number of instances where either the prosecutor and/or the attorney general did not agree with the recommendation. And in those instances, we noted that in the report, and we provided the rationale and reasoning for the prosecutor and the attorney general's positions. So if you get the report and you want to know what the thinking is, what was the thinking of the attorney general? Why would they not support that recommendation? Or why did the prosecutor abstain from that recommendation? The reasons are actually in the report.
Well, this is great stuff. I think the Native Hawaiian Justice Task Force, came up with some great recommendations. I think you highlighted, the 8 recommendations that probably should be implemented. And I really hope that, in the future that they move forward to implement all these programs because, as you said, Native Hawaiians are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice
Right.
system. And there has to be something done about that.
Yeah, and just let me end by saying that we've studied the issue enough. We don't need any more task forces. I think we all kind of know what we need to do. Now it's a question of getting it done.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you for joining us, Judge
Thanks,
Broderick.
Aaron.
Thank you for taking time out of your schedule.
You're very welcome.
Join us for next week for another show of Rehabilitation Coming Soon as we continue our discussion of the mass incarceration practices of the United States and the effect on the state of Hawaii. Our guest next week will be lecturer in law Ken Lawson. Please stay tuned because coming up next is Sustainable Hawaii with Kirsten Turner. Thank you.